today we have Neal and Alan in here, and we're going to talk about some stuff about how we all became to understand that nuclear should be a part of the solution. Uh, my views on this are well advertised. Alan's views are probably also well advertised, but Neal is somewhat of an unknown factor here. And I am very grateful. I have to thank him for giving me my first opportunity speaking in front of people. And I want to give him the opportunity to let you get him known somewhat better. So, Neal, why don't you tell us who you are and how you ended up in this predicament?
Okay, hi. Yes, thanks. Thanks for having us. Yeah, basically, for a long time, I was just accepting that climate change was there and things were going along and it was going to be tackled. And I was obviously aware of like the inconvenient truth and the zeitgeist movement and all those things. But about 5 years ago, I just started to get really down that not enough was being done about the solution. And I guess I'd just come to the conclusion many years ago that the scientific method is the best way to find solutions to problems, and it wasn't really being used. So I did open up a bookshop, coffee store stroke bookshop, to try to advocate for science. I'm not a scientist. I'm just an ordinary Joe who has come to the conclusion that to fix problems, we're going to need to use a scientific method. And yeah, we did some really good stuff in the 3 years we were open. Unfortunately, the business model wasn't viable because the rents were so expensive in the town centre. So now I just run a Facebook page and social media at the moment, why we are actually raising money to open up a different sort of project, and we'll go along the lines, but it's more about waste food and waste and sustainability in general. And we're looking for a property to open up another shop soon. But yeah, so I just call myself a science advocate, I guess, and reading. I was fully involved in the environmental movement, the zeitgeist. That yeah, we can do this all through renewables and wind power and solar, but then sort of like stories start to prop up about precious metals and stuff. So I started to investigate further, and I never really had a fear of nuclear power, which is strange because I was brought up in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, where at school we used to do drills where you had to get under a table and to survive
Duck
a
and
nuclear.
cover.
Yeah, and told us how at home to get under the stairs to protect yourself, sort of thing. But I never really had a fear of nuclear. And when I started to look into it, realizing that there seemed to be an issue at odds with renewables being able to do the problem, and being heavily involved in sort of like the Green Party locally and some environmental movements, it struck me that a lot of the people involved that have come of the sort of like, they were protesters at nuclear power, not nuclear power plants, nuclear bomb sites, Greenham Common and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And they had this natural hate of nuclear, and I was sort of like, okay, we need to do something about this. So I guess that's how I arrived at the point of investigating more about nuclear.
Yeah. So and how so right now we could call you a community organizer, right?
Yeah, I do a lot of stuff in the community for sure. For sure.
Yeah, because what I recall, so I don't exactly know how it went. I believe that I shot you. I basically sent you an email, and that's right after I published my first book, Highway to Dystopia, and that's already a couple of years ago. I mean, that's in 2015,
Yeah,
and somehow we ended up having a meeting in your bookstore in
yeah,
Watford
yeah.
in front of, I don't know, 15, 20 people, something like that.
Yeah, a lot of environmentalists locally, and
Yeah.
it was an interesting thing because there was definitely some anti-nuclear people there.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Caroline.
Yeah, yeah. But
Did you remember that when I was shaking everybody's hands, I she said, "Well, what's the point of giving you a name if you aren't going to remember it?"
Did she?
And I was like, well, challenge accepted.
Well done, well done.
And I still know her name.
But in fact, yeah, it was your book, Highway to Dystopia, which was very easy read. But sort of like clarified a lot of the things I'd been thinking about myself without forming any conclusions, and then maybe start to deep dive into the subject a bit more.
Yeah, and so when did you close the bookstore?
Oh, that'll be 18 months ago.
18 months ago.
18 months ago.
And what have you done ever since to keep the ball rolling, to keep the guys and girls coming together?
Yeah, so unfortunately, on the science advocacy, I must say the ball has slipped over the last couple of years, and I have to completely blame Brexit on that, because it's all consuming over here. Brexit.
Yeah.
Because
But you're active in the in doing the Brexit stuff, getting people together and the Brexit
yeah. I'm
stuff
part
like
of the
that.
local Europe campaign.
Yeah.
But I'm one of the reasons being I'm a fundamental believer that we can't tackle climate change if Britain can't work with 29 other countries.
Yeah.
On these sort of issues. So that's actually one of my, when I was campaigning before Brexit, that was one of the things I used to use, and it was an argument people hadn't heard, and they found it very convincing, actually.
Yeah, that's absolutely logical.
So
this is not a local problem.
Exactly, that was what I was trying to tell people.
Yeah, it's not something that we can solve in our backyard by just planting some tomato plants and not eating any cows anymore.
Yeah, but luckily we've managed to keep a community of people that we got together in Reason Coffee Shop, and we work under the banner of Random Cafe at the moment, which is the junk food project, the Waste Food Cafe.
Yeah, with Jane.
Yeah, with Jane and Nikki and Claire and loads of other people, Catherine. And that's going to be the platform for bringing, once post-Brexit, get back onto the science advocacy.
Do I have a legacy within that group? Are there times when people say, remember when that weird Dutch guy came and told us that we should reconsider our views on nuclear
for sure.
energy?
And you definitely change people's minds. Absolutely. And people who really hadn't thought about the issue. Just, this makes complete sense. Sort of.
Yeah. So the funny thing is, Alan and I, we have had our deep dives, right? We have done our deep dives. So we came at this from I wouldn't say different. I mean, I came from it as being a pro renewable guy doing the maths and not being able to square the math, and just also not being anti-nuclear, but just basically not paying it any heed. But afterwards done the deep dives and became so knowledgeable about nuclear that I was like, well, people are really not, they're really on the wrong path, and they don't understand why we need it, and they have all these weird reasons why not to want nuclear, and I wanted to do something against that. And I believe that Alan comes from a slightly different background. So why don't you tell Neal how you became a pro-nuclear activist, Alan?
Sure. Well, I had I've always been interested in technology things, and I'm an engineer by trade. I do telecommunications stuff. I've enjoyed doing that, and I have two sons, and one of them one day, he was in school for civil engineering, and he sent me a video link to somebody that was talking about thorium fueled, liquid thorium. The lifters is what they're called, liquid thorium fuel reactors, and which is a technology that is being pursued today by some companies, but wasn't really that wasn't really the case back then, and this is probably 7 or 8 years ago. So I started to look into that, and that was pretty exciting, and I just thought, well, this is really cool. It seems to do a better job at least on paper, than the things that I know about anyway, at being efficient and not leaving as much waste behind and things like that. So I had some nominal knowledge of how nuclear reactors work today, even in the commercial world. But I had not done a deep dive at that point. So when I started to get involved in this, and I, did some Thorium Energy Alliance conferences where I met a lot of smart people. I started to hang out online with some really smart people.
Including
All of
me.
them, including T's, and all of them smarter than me.
No, not me.
Um, so, they and what I learned was what we have today is really, really, really good, and we don't need to wait for something better. We can certainly work on something better, but we don't need to wait for it. And
He's talking about nuclear reactors, by the way.
Nuclear reactors today that we use for energy. The 430 of them or so that are around the world, or 450 maybe. And the really the at that same time is when I started to become much more aware of the issue of global warming, climate change, and those two just kind of meshed together. And so I started to spend some time online. I'm still working as my day job, but in my evenings and weekends, and here and there during the day, I would poke around and talk to people about it. And what I found was that people are actually pretty receptive about it when you actually just talk to them about it and you listen to them. But I also became much more aware of a pretty vocal minority that is against any sort of nuclear. And so I started to ask the question, well, what do you have instead? And what they came up with wasn't. It didn't seem to me like it would be nearly enough to do the job. So my avocation is an avocation, not anything I get. I'm not a paid nuclear shill. I keep waiting for my checks from Westinghouse or somebody, but they never come. So instead, I just do some video chats with T's and other things.
Trying to reach more people.
Try to reach more people, and I am active in Generation Atomic, which is an NGO that works to get a pro-nuclear message out and to advocate for pro-nuclear legislation and education, things like that. So,
I guess for me, it came from the fear of climate change in the first place, sort of looking into how bad things could possibly get. It came from that angle, and it just didn't really make sense to me why we would write any options off the table, because as far as I'm concerned, and I still am now, even though I'm definitely a nuclear advocate, that we need just to throw everything at this thing.
We agree. We agree. Yeah. I just because there's this ongoing I wouldn't call it feud on Twitter, but there's a very vocal pro-nuclear group that wants only nuclear. I do somewhat sympathize with them because I do see some shortcomings in renewables, but I am one of those people who says, well, as long as the emphasis is on decarbonization and we understand that nuclear is the cornerstone in that project, we can add wind and solar to that world. No, I don't have any qualms with that. The only thing that I really have to put an effort in is when people start doing stuff like the great Mark C. Jacobson in California, who wrote this, everybody can go renewables, and he forgot to tell the people what the prerequisites for that are, which are basically living in abject energy poverty around the world. I'm all for, cutting emissions and making sure that we use energy more efficiently. but that doesn't mean that we basically have to regress. And that's what he wants from the West. And he doesn't have any progress for non-OECD. So that's when I really get, I get on my high on the bandwagon and say, stop. This nonsense needs to stop now. And so I'm not anti-renewables at all. I do see a reason, and I do see a place for them, and I do think that we need to even increase renewable deployments by a factor of 2, maybe 3. But we have to, say we have to make a set. We have to point at a point where we say now the market is saturated, and if we go beyond that, we will need so much more materials, and we will be starting to dig another grave. Basically, that's my fear, and that's because of the cumulative nature of renewables, in a sense that they are not long lived. They don't last for a long time. 30 years is pretty much an optimistic maximum. Some people say, well, yeah, they can operate for longer than 30 or 35 years, but there's nobody willing to invest in that proposal. Most investments are done with a 15 to 20 year lifespan in mind, and that's just because of chemistry and because of materials fatigue and those kinds of things. And that's why you get this cumulative upkeep. And this cumulative upkeep keeps going and keeps going and keeps going, and until you reach your saturation point, and then you get your maximum amount of renewable that you need to add each year in order to make sure that you can also cope with what you're losing each year 30 years down the road. So that's one of my main concerns, but I'm still advocating for building more, but with prudence instead of balls to the walls, let's go. Put the pedal to the metal, floor the accelerator, and do it. That's just not prudent. It's not smart.
Yeah. So when I contacted you, I contacted you, just said, well, why don't I just, as someone who's in a lot of groups, environmental groups,
yes,
put some of the kickback I get, and obviously I answer it the best I can, but I just sort of put some of these questions to you.
Yeah, of course. You could share this video if you want to.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be great.
I will also what I also will do is I will put references in the links down below. So if we make a claim, I will make sure that it is referenced, so that you can say, well, the references are down there, so you can look it up for yourself. Don't take their word for it.
Yeah, that's brilliant. Yeah, that's fantastic.
I think that's the best way to go forward, right?
I think if I put some of these questions to you, and then it will turn back into a general conversation afterwards, I guess.
Yeah.
Cool.
Shoot.
So, one of the first ones that always comes up is, what about the storing of waste for 10,000 years?
I would like Alan to answer that question, because he has some really good ideas about that.
Well, something that you can always start with there is it's not waste unless you waste it, and that's really a key thing, because most of what we're talking about, and typically people are referring to used nuclear fuel. So the fuel bundles of the fuel assemblies that come out of a nuclear reactor after it cannot use them anymore. It's they've done their jobs, and they have to be swapped out for new ones. Those are indeed, if we just let them sit, they would have some quite measurable radioactivity, which goes down over time pretty quickly initially. The level of radioactivity in those drops rapidly once it's out of the reactor, and the content of what you have, the content of those fuel bundles and fuel assemblies that come out is mostly still uranium. So most of what's in there is still something that could produce energy to the tune of over 95%, depending on what the burn up rate is in that particular reactor and what type of reactor it is. So almost all the energy that we started with is still there, and it doesn't make any sense really for us to just throw that away. I mean, that's kind of what we think about doing with waste is let's just throw it away somewhere. Let's put it in the landfill. Let's, well, we can recycle it, and we should be doing that. But right now uh, it's not economical to do that in most places. France does recycle their fuel, as does some other there are some other places where that happens as well. In the U.S., we don't, so that it just sits there. But what we should remember is my first point, which is it's not waste unless you waste it, and we can use it to extract a lot more energy out of it without doing any more mining at all.
Yeah.
And that's a pretty key point. So, we do need to have places where we can put reasonably long-lived nuclear radioactive waste to keep it out of the out of the groundwater and out of the environment for some period of time, but we really don't need to worry about doing that for something that's going to be 10 or 100,000 years still lethal at that point, or still radioactive really in any way at that point, because we really don't worry about that in the same way about the mercury and other heavy metals that are in other wastes that we generate so much more of every single day.
And that never goes away.
Right, and those things don't die out like radioactivity does. So what we really should be doing with that nuclear waste is just storing it until it's ready to be used, because we do have there are reactor designs that we've already built that there aren't very many of them running around the world, but we talk about fast reactors or sodium cooled fast reactors. Those are able to take that waste and essentially fission the rest of the fuel that's in there over time, and use it to generate clean electricity for humanity to use. And so it doesn't make any sense for us to waste that. And once you do that, what you're left with ultimately is something that's really probably needs to be sequestered, but even that is likely to be usable at some point in the future when we learn more about the things that those particular elements that the actinides and the transuranics that come out of that. Those are things that we only get from nuclear reactors. So they are special elements. They're things that we don't get in nature, and they probably have uses that we don't know about yet. So, and what we have to do with those, if we did throw them away, is to keep them out of the environment for something more like 300 years.
Just store them.
So we really just don't. I don't even think we need, for a nuclear fuel. Used nuclear fuel type waste, I don't think that ultimately we're going to need a deep repository at all, because we'll just use it all. There are other things like from nuclear medicine and other technologies that use nuclear technology, other products that use technology like that, that do produce materials that are radioactive that need to be sequestered somehow. But we're worried way too much about that, in my opinion. The radiation that comes from those kinds of things and the amount of that we have is just not big enough for us to stop whole technologies just because of that.
Exactly. So, and I wanted to add it requires a slightly different mindset. So instead of seeing it as a liability and as a waste, we have to see it as something that we want to put in the bank, because oh my goodness, running out of time. I just got a message that we had our 40-minute limit, but that's all right. But we have to switch from it being something that that is considered a waste and hazardous to something that we want to put in a bank, because it's so valuable. There's already for thousands of years worth of uranium sitting in those things that we consider waste, which is ridiculous actually. Why would we throw it away if it's that valuable? And,
Yeah.
and apart from that, what Alan didn't mention is we have also the possibility of molten salt reactors, and those reactors are far more versatile than the light water reactors that we have today. I'm not any slight to the light water reactors. I think they're excellent, but those kind of reactors offer us even more versatility and higher burn up rates. It's right now they think that they can use about 95% of all the fuel instead of 4%, which happens in the light water reactor.
So I'm guessing most people aren't aware that you can actually do that today. That's probably a message you need to get out. Because definitely on the groups I'm in, it's like, yeah, that's technology that's like 2 decades, 3 decades away.
No, absolutely not. So the reactor that Alan mentioned earlier is actually commercially available, and there's one running, and there's one more being built in China. So one is running in Russia, which is called the BN 800, and it's basically the child of the BN 600 and one other reactor I can't recall. I don't recall whether it is a BN or something else, but they have decades worth of experience with that process, and they actually have a running reactor which has been operating for several years now, and the Chinese are building another one. And those molten salt reactors, we built one in the 60s and ran it for 4 years, and we are redesigning those, making those. So the point is, there are companies who are designing those, but because the reactor was operational so long ago, some of the operational knowledge has been lost. Nobody has been fiddling with the knobs for a long time. There are people who are experts in molten salt reactors, and but luckily, I think it's not going to take more than 5 years before the first shovel goes in. And it's not just for a theoretical reactor; it's just for an iteration of something that already existed.
Good. Yeah. So, okay, obviously one of the ones you get kickback is on Chernobyl and Fukushima. So, if you just want to give me your opinions on that,
Alan?
Sure. Chernobyl was just a horrible accident, but it wasn't particularly deadly. And what it showed us was that even in the worst case man-made scenarios, so you think about nature throwing its worst at something, and man said throwing our worst at something, and creating the worst disasters we could possibly think of for any technology, nuclear or otherwise. And what basically Chernobyl was is us, us doing the stupidest things we possibly could to make as many mistakes as possible, or to do as many things that on purpose that were wrong to do as possible. And so you had a bad design, you had a bad you had untrained or poorly trained operators, you had bureaucracy that was making uninformed decisions about things, and ultimately that resulted in a steam explosion that ejected a huge amount of radioactivity material directly into the environment, and which is something that would never happen in a Western reactor because we have containment buildings on all of our reactors. So, and that wasn't contained like that. But what we found was that the initial death toll from the first responders and the people that were immediately in the reactor building is less than 50. And it's a horrible thing when people die, particularly when they die like that. Radiation sickness is a horrible thing, but the number of people doesn't compare at all with so many other industrial accidents that happen just all the time, and it in particular doesn't compare with the number of people that die from coal pollution and other fossil fuels that are burned every year, and the particulates that go into the atmosphere, never mind the CO2, which is also having its indirect effect on the livelihoods of so many people, and will well into the future. So even if we had a Chernobyl every year, we would still have to be looking at nuclear. If we looked at the numbers, we would still have to be looking at nuclear as pretty much the safest energy source that we have. And from an environmental point of view, there's an exclusion zone that's around Chernobyl. It actually attracts 40 or 50,000 people a year now as tourists. People go there all the time, and there are some hot spots, and usually the guides will tell you not to hang around there too long. But in general, the wildlife are thriving there. And so what we saw there was the same thing that we saw in Fukushima, which is that the evacuation of the people was in the end more harmful than it would have been for most of them to just shelter in place. And we haven't looked at that as carefully in Chernobyl. I think there's still some things that we just don't know that much about in terms of what happened, because the Soviets were so secretive at the time. But we have we have lots of data from Fukushima, which shows us that almost all the people that were moved out of their homes in undamaged locations where the tsunami was not, and I know I'm talking about Fukushima now, but it's really the same thing. Our response to radiation, our fear of it, and our panic that happens when we believe that there's something out there that we can't see, we can't smell, we can't taste, and it's going to hurt us. That's proving in both situations proved to be much more harmful than the actual radiation itself. That's what the key, really.
Yeah, that's what Malcolm Grimston, who is a former professor at Imperial College in London, I believe, he is very adamant about this, and he says, listen, the point is there's nothing irrational, and this might sound strange coming from me. There's nothing irrational about the fear of nuclear radiation, as long as our nuclear companies and the government keep doing these things, keep talking about safety and doing mass evacuations whenever something happens at a plant. If that's the standard of response to such an accident, it's quite rational for people to become afraid for nuclear radiation. But it doesn't have to be, because we now know that once a big release of radiation happens, and we do the correct things, take iodine tablets, stay inside the house, don't eat the strawberries for a time, everything actually will be all right. And I mean, there's practical proof of that. There's actually people living inside the Chernobyl exclusion zone, and it seems that they are not, the only thing that they are facing is basically attrition, because their community has gone. So that's worse for them, but they still live healthy lives.
And healthier than many of their friends and neighbors that did not return. There, people have been living back in the Chernobyl in that area since 1987. I mean, they came back, went through the forest, and went back to their homes, because that's where they wanted to be. That's where they lived. And
they even have church services there every weekend.
Yeah, they're happier and healthier in general than the people that were displaced and had to live in in an apartment or something, basically for the rest of their lives, many of them.
Yeah.
So when I try to talk to people about, you mentioned air pollution and particulates a little bit earlier. When I try to talk to people about that, you just really can't get the same impact, because I live in London, Greater London area, and it's estimated that about 9,000 people a year die of air pollution in London.
Yeah,
it's 9,000 people that, if we had clean air,
exactly,
would be living much longer, healthier, lives, costing the NHS and the health services less money.
It's 450 times more people than died from Chernobyl.
Yeah, and that seems to just hit a blank wall. That message just goes in. They still see the scary,
the boogeyman.
The boogeyman, the mushroom cloud.
Yeah, and that's a sad story. And I've come to realize that it's not necessarily irrational, but the irrationality has come forth as a result of how the government and the industry itself manifest themselves when speaking to the general public. It's they just do it the wrong way. They just, all they're talking about is safety this and safety that. The thing is, it's okay to be safe, right? And I mean, the safety record of the nuclear industry is exemplary. I mean, it goes on without a hitch for decades now, and we have more than 250,000 people working in the nuclear industry worldwide. I mean, it's a big industry. And yet, every time when they start, even so, I was at the nuclear exhibition, World Nuclear Exhibition last year, and every booth has safety this and safety that, and some people just get spooked and they think, well, if they are talking about safety, it must be something incredibly dangerous that they are doing there. And it's just this. It's disproportionate. It's disproportionate. The actual risk is much lower, and even if we would do ancient designs like the Chernobyl designs, the risk to public health would be much lower if we didn't panic whenever something happened than the risks we face from everyday life: smoking cigarettes, drinking beer, eating red meat,
driving cars.
Yeah, driving cars, trying to cross the road, flying.
Yeah, it's risk assessment by the human mind doesn't do a good job of risk assessment.
I want to add, somebody told this: there is no airplane company in the world that said, this year we made safer wings for our planes. Nobody takes out advertising space to say, we are now the safest airline in the world, but the nuclear industry does it. I mean, it's similar, right?
Yeah. So one of the other kickbacks you get on Fukushima is what about when the next tsunami happens, because nuclear power plants are built near the sea.
Oh, that's quite easy to refute. Japan has been scared shitless. Sorry for the word. And they have basically shut down every nuclear reactor after Fukushima happened. A totally overblown response, because that response has actually caused more carbon emissions, because they have built new coal plants and new gas plants, and plenty of them. And they've done it at record speed. And they are now in the process of restarting all of their reactors one by one, after having assessed, done all the modeling and raising the dikes in some scenarios and putting, the diesel generators higher up. And so basically what you can say when these people say, well, what if another tsunami comes, is fairly simple. We are a human species. We adapt to circumstances. This has been a learning moment, and the evidence is clear. Japan has learned from it, and all the other countries have learned from it, and they have adapted.
Cool.
That simple.
A couple of the what I find to be the more silly questions, but just to get it out there.
Yeah. That's cool.
What about all the concrete it takes to build nuclear power stations?
Oh, that's a cool one. That's one of mine, Alan.
Yeah.
So what about all the concrete? So I have done a lot of analysis on how much materials are used for renewables and nuclear, and I base my nuclear figure on an old Generation 2 design, which is not really efficient in terms of material usage. if you look at what we call a boiling water reactor 10, 300 megawatt, which is a new design, it claims that it uses 60% less concrete than, I believe, the EP1000 reactor, which is already one that uses 40% less than a Generation 2 reactor, upon which I base my figures. The old rinky-dink Generation 2 reactor uses materials 20 to 36 times more efficiently than a wind farm or a solar farm. And that's what I do is pretty simple. I take whatever the contraption we want to build, and I account for all the energy it's going to produce over the lifespan that it will exist. And then I take the pile of materials that we've put in, and I basically divide those two figures. So what you get is you get basically how much materials do I have to invest per terawatt hour of energy you want to get produced. And by that measure, nuclear is between 20 and 35, 36 times better in material usage than solar or wind. And that's all steel, concrete, copper, neodymium magnets.
That's not even taking into account, as we go forward, the storage options we're going to need for renewables, is it?
Well, yeah.
Or is it?
Yeah, the point is renewable recycling is mainly concentrated on recovering the steel.
Sorry. Again, that's another issue. But I mean, as we scale up renewables, we're going to need storage. Make it feasible.
Exactly.
So it's even worse than those figures you're giving us.
Yeah, much.
Right, and we don't really have good options for that right now. I mean, pumped hydro is the only real large scale storage mechanism that we have that works at a utility scale, and not only works where you can do it because of elevation changes available to you, and it does have an environmental impact, a pretty significant one. So,
I've seen some design for some underwater ones for the sea, but they use a massive amount of concrete.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's based on buoyancy. They push something down, and that displaces water. And once the energy is required, they just let it float back up again, and that change in elevation is then used to generate electricity.
Right. Yeah. So making the kilowatt hours usable, all kilowatt hours are not created equal. So if it's usable coming from the source, like it is with the nuclear plant or other thermal plants, fossil fuels, then you don't really have to add anything to it to make it something that you can sell on the grid, other than transmission and distribution. With an intermittent source, you have to have other stuff that you've got to have storage. You've got to have other ancillary services that are required to make the grid work. The 50 or 60 cycle frequency of AC is carefully governed, and there are mechanisms on the grid that do that, and that allow you to survive the failure of even a large generator on the grid and have the end users not really notice anything. That's all because of a lot of stuff that's in place that that's not generation, right? And so, and those things become much more difficult to do, and aren't just part of the package that you get when you have an intermittent source. And those costs are rarely included when somebody looks at the cost of a solar panel kilowatt hour versus that from a nuclear plant or a fossil fuel plant or anything else.
So you mentioned fluctuating demand for electricity, and actually one of the kickbacks I often get is that nuclear isn't able to handle fluctuations in.
That's absolutely nonsense. So first of all, there are designs in the world operating today that do that are specifically designed to be flexible in their load bearing capacity. I believe that Switzerland or Austria has one of those reactors. France, I do know they ramp up and down but on a weekly basis because their manufacturing base basically dies every weekend, so they don't need as much energy during the weekend, which means that they can shut down about half of their fleet every weekend. I believe it's even more. But the thing is that the question is whether you want to do that. So I have been thinking about this a lot lately, and it turns out that you can do a lot more with nuclear heat than just generate electricity. You can also use it to desalinate water. You can also use it to basically pump heat into a big, rock storage facility where you basically have crushed rocks that you will heat up, and you can use that heat later on for other purposes. You can also use nuclear heat for district heating. So basically, my proposition will be this. You want your nuclear reactor to be running 100% of the time, or at least close to 100%. Not take an interest in, having to ramp up and down just because the electricity market demands that it does, but basically produce another commodity that is more valuable to us than electricity at that moment, which can be either water or fuel or heat. And once we need more electricity or baseload power, we switch over to electricity production, which basically makes the plant more economic. Better, it makes it even more profitable. So, and the thing is, we can also build reactors that can ramp up and down in time scales of 10 minutes or so. And that's enough. If you have a small battery somewhere or something else that can pick up the slack, you can do it with nuclear, no problem.
Okay, so next question it's too expensive. And certainly the reason we get this in the UK is actually because Hinkley C is going to be bloody expensive.
I think it's cheap.
Yeah. Right. I say what cost you put on clean energy and clean air.
Yeah, again, the all kilowatt hours are not created equal. So, if you look at it over the long term, over the lifespan of the nuclear plant, nuclear always wins the price question. It always wins, and the reason that it does is because it lasts for a long time, and the operational costs are pretty modest. So, upfront capital costs and the financing of those is the single biggest thing that drives your ultimate cost to build a large plant. The plants that we build today are large. They're big infrastructure projects. They should be compared to interstate highway systems,
bridges,
and bridges, not a solar farm of some sort. That's really an apples and oranges kind of a thing. And what you get out of them is usable, on day one. So it provides the ancillary services. It provides the constant, reliable energy without having to have any storage along with that. And as T's mentioned, all the new designs are capable of load following to whatever level you really want them to be. I mean, it's just a choice that you make when you operate it. Sometimes that's going to be a choice where you have to come up with it's best for you to come up with something else that can be used when you don't need all the electricity and you don't need all the energy for that. But those are we understand what those things are, and there's some pretty serious work being done to actually commercialize that kind of thing ultimately going forward. But until we shut down the last coal plant, the last gas plant, the last thing that burns stuff, we're going to need as much of this as we can build. And if climate change is really a crisis, then even if I'm paying twice or three times as much for nuclear energy as I pay for some other sort, we still got to do it. And that's not a choice that we have.
No.
Yeah. And straight after that discussion, people always go on to the decommissioning costs.
Yeah. So here's the thing, and first of all, paddling back to Hinkley C, the 3,200 megawatt electric plant. It's going to be 2 reactors, 1600 megawatt electric each. Those are huge reactors. They are really huge. I believe those are the biggest you can build at this moment. The cost aspect for Hinkley C is being judged too harshly. First of all, because it's a first of a kind reactor that has never been built before, and so there are a couple of unknowns there. But once you look at it from a different perspective, and I'm doing the same here as I did with the materials thing. I look at two 1600 megawatt reactors producing energy for 80 years, and then counting backwards, dividing that figure with the amount of money that has been installed. It actually turns out to be cheaper per kilowatt hour than the London Array, for instance, which is a huge wind farm out to sea from London. It's actually cheaper, but that's because people don't look at it from a long perspective. They only see the upfront costs, which are indeed high. I mean, 25 billion pounds is not a cheap plant. It's not a cheap plant, but when you consider that it will run for 80 years, that paints a whole different picture. Besides, this is something that these people should acknowledge, is that this Hinkley C will be a place for thousands of people to work for the next 80 years. It will basically be enough to supply enough wages for a city, that's like, I believe that it can basically carry the economic load of a small city, 50,000 people or something like that. The economic output from that plant, not just electricity, but also taxes that it will pay, the wages it will pay, because it has to pay property taxes and such, for instance. But it also has to pay taxes on the economic output that it generates. So for each kilowatt hour of electricity that is generated, it will pay a tax. So there's the windfall of such a plant is orders of magnitude bigger than the London Array, for instance, where only like a handful of people have to work, and where it is far more expensive for them to get out because they need a boat and they need all kinds of equipment and stuff that, I rather have the nuclear power plant because it's a much better economic force to have in a region, especially when you consider, for instance, losing 10,000 jobs because a car manufacturer moves out.
Okay.
That's much more stable.
So I think that's covered most of the sort of people who want fully renewables, but then you obviously get the lobby from the fossil fuel who we can just do it with clean coal.
Yeah. So first of all, I didn't address the decommissioning costs. I'm sorry, but that's quite easy to do. I did it back then because then there was this DEC drama, the Department of Energy and Climate Change, and they had a couple of billion tucked away for decommissioning. Well, that's for the Magnox reactors, which are publicly owned in England, which means that you own it, the taxpayers. Yeah. But for the other plants, like that are owned by EDF, I believe, right? It's in England, it's EDF.
Yeah, operated, right?
Yeah, they actually put aside a part of their profits and put it into a fund that is required for the decommissioning of their plant. So basically, the ratepayer pays for it during the use of the electricity. So it's an integral part of the electricity price.
Excellent. An operational cost.
Yeah.
Right.
Excellent. Yeah. So the clean coal is that a unicorn? Is it scalable?
Yeah.
Is it...
No.
It's certainly we have technology that's been explored and in some cases even run at a commercial level that can sequester. Perhaps not all, but most of the carbon, the carbon dioxide that comes out of a coal plant. it's a hard problem to do at scale. We have technology to do it on an individual plant basis, and that's becoming a little bit more palatable from an economic perspective. Here in the U.S., there's a plant in Texas, I believe, that has been doing that. But there are still some problems like, what do we do with that carbon dioxide, and how do we keep it sequestered basically forever? I mean, you talk about keeping, nuclear waste sequestered forever, where you also have to do that with carbon dioxide, and you have to do that in a way that doesn't allow, for instance, at some point in the future, all of a sudden, this huge reservoir, whatever it is, wherever you have it, underground or in liquid form somewhere, whatever, escapes, because something fails. Now you're back to the same situation that you were before. So we have to keep things like that in mind. I do think that if we can indeed scale that up some, at least, that it can help us get past the hump, because we're 80% fossil fuels worldwide. I mean, we just burn a huge amount of that stuff, and it's going to be very difficult for us to just keep it in the ground. That's just such a simplistic view of things. So anything that we can do to allow us to not, negatively impact, a lot of people's lives and livelihoods, and because energy just runs society. It's such it's like the single most important thing that we have is energy to make our lives what they are today, and to improve the lives of so many people around the world that don't have what we have. We need just tons of energy, and so I'm not bullish on it, but I see that it's something that we need to continue to work on. And it still comes with all the same issues that you have with mining coal. And what do you do with the other part of the waste? The slag that comes out of it, the coal ash. We could mine that for the radioactive materials in it and use it in nuclear reactors. I mean, that's been actually explored before. So perhaps that's something that we will also do. But it's, managing waste. I mean, we have to manage the waste from everything we do.
Yeah.
And basically the only place that we do that well right now is nuclear energy. So,
we also have to consider the volume. So in Europe, we are building one clean coal power station.
Yeah.
It's called Datteln 4. It's in Western Germany. And that thing, first of all, it has taken ages to build. So I know that sounds like the same thing that we get slung at our heads all the time, but it's orders of magnitude more intricate. It's such an incredible, because it's a complete industrial complex that is built right next to it, just to separate out the coal ash, the carbon dioxide, and then do something with it. Now there is a way to sequester that carbon dioxide permanently. That is to basically bubble it into water. What you then do is you create carbonic acid, basically, and once you pump this carbonic acid into basalt, it turns that basalt into limestone. And that's a permanent sequestration method for carbon dioxide. You will never, ever get carbon dioxide from that ever again. It's going to take literally millions, hundreds of millions, perhaps even billions of years for that carbon content ever to get into the atmosphere ever again. If
there's some technology that you can also that's been worked on recently that takes the CO2 in it, and it makes essentially building materials from that. So cinder blocks, and that's pretty permanent. That's pretty.
Yeah, that's what they do with the fertilizer plant. The local fertilizer plant over here is owned by OCI Nitrogen, which is one of the biggest fertilizer producers in the world. And one of the problems of fertilizer production is that you have carbon emissions, you have CO2 emissions and carbon monoxide emissions. And what they do is they catch some of that and they then turn it into basically what you would consider the same stuff that you get from wood. Wood. Melamine. Yeah. So they make a couple of million pounds of that stuff each year, and that's indeed used as construction blocks and such. So there's stuff that you can do with carbon dioxide, but I'd rather not go to coal, the clean coal route, because the volume that you have to manage is just orders of magnitude bigger than the volume that you have to manage.
Still the most rapidly growing energy source in the world, I think, is coal. So.
Just to give you an impression of just how much nuclear fuel there is, that's less than the Empire State Building. All the nuclear fuel in the world that we can dig up at this moment, that's less than the Empire State Building in terms of volume. The waste that can come from that, if we call it that, I call it, put it in the bank instead of call it waste, is 2 Empire State Buildings in volume. Well, if you look at coal ash, that's more than Manhattan each year. So it's just orders of magnitude bigger. There's just no comparing it.
Okay, so so they were basically some of the kickbacks I get when I'm just on these groups. But one of the things I try to talk to people about is you mentioned the Mark Jacobs model earlier that relies on renewables.
Yeah,
and that's been taken up by a lot of like the Green Party and they sort of use that.
Yeah, comes from Stanford University. Who would argue with that, right?
Yeah, well, one, I don't agree with it because it relies on keeping half the world in poverty that they're already in.
That's it.
And doesn't really ask the West to stop very much. So it's a bit of a xenophobic policy, if you ask me.
It is.
Yeah, right.
But even putting that aside, I just try to say to people, look how well in Europe we coped with the Syrian refugee crisis that was in part caused by
climate change,
drought and climate change.
Yeah.
Well, most of the population on this half of the world live south of the border in areas that are going to be suffered the worst and have droughts, crop shortages.
France is going to turn into Spain.
They're all going to want to come north.
Yeah. And
one of the few ways we have of trying to tackle this is carbon capture. And whether that be through technology or whether it be through reforestation of the Sahara
soil remediation,
that's going to need a ton of water, and that water is going to have to come from desalination. So therefore, we're going to need loads more electricity. Tons more electricity that we use now.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely correct.
And because
people don't understand, because first of all, there are people who suggest that we should decarbonize only electricity using renewables. I always say that kind of feasible, but a Harvard study or MIT study, it's from Jesse Jenkins, suggests that it is better to include 1/3 firm baseload power, and that it will be a lot cheaper than doing it with renewables alone, because it's much harder to reach your saturation point, basically. But that's only electricity, and I always raise my finger and I say, listen guys, you're only solving 25% of the emissions problem here. Electricity is only 25% of all the emissions. 25% is agriculture and land use, so deforestation, cattle raising, trying to get palm oil, sugar beets, those kind of things. That's 25% of the emissions. Then there's 50% of the emissions is then spread over to industrial processes, transportation, and such. So most people don't even realize that only doing the electricity bit is only solving 1/4 of the problem, and that 1/4 of the problem is not going to get solved in a conventional energy context at all. That's the agriculture bit, the agriculture and forestation bit. So to presume, and then we get guys like Mark C. Jacobson who presume to do it all, but then basically force us to regress. Make everybody cut energy, including the non-OECD. So basically maintaining the status quo, but then saying, but everybody gets poorer, right? Everybody gets poorer. That's what he says. That's just immoral. It's absolutely immoral, especially given the fact that we have technologies that can basically, and I wouldn't say that we necessarily need to maintain our standard of living. I mean, I could probably do with 1/3 less energy, and which means 1/3 less of all the stuff that I own. But to ask that from a poor person who lives in Kenya and who has to provide for 12 kids and has a mother that lives in with him, and their lifestyle won't change, and that's just not good enough, because there's 800 billion, 700 million people that don't have access to clean water, that have to walk for miles and miles and miles each day to get water, and then have to cook it afterwards in order to make sure that they can drink it. And there's about 1 billion people living in poverty in the world, and poverty is directly linked to not having access to energy, not necessarily electricity, but it's a part of it. And these people, they deserve a better life. And the countries that they live in, they are actually pushing to get more energy because they want more. They want to have a more equitable life for their citizenry. Because poverty costs them a lot of money and headaches as well, and they want to, they want to become richer and more prosperous, and they have a right not to be in poverty. And and Mark C. Jacobson is going to keep them in poverty.
But that's just not going to work, though, because I mean, when we sold the story of climate change on television, whether it be Blue Planet or whatever, or there's going to be less fish, there's going to be less animals, there's going to be less plants. Isn't it going to be terrible? They're not telling the real story of what's going to happen, in my opinion, is you're going to get hundreds of millions, if not billions of people moving around the world. And that can only lead to war.
looking for a better life or a life.
And people will put up barriers, and that will lead to war, and it'll be war that
stress our society like we can't even imagine.
Yeah.
If we think that Syria is a big deal, that's child's play compared to what is coming. If we don't address this, and it's like Ken Caldera said. He said, listen, our heads are not going to explode in 12 years when we have not managed to solve climate change. It's not as if there will be a cataclysm that will kill us all in one go. It's going to be a very gradual but increasing decline. So it will be gradual, but it will be picking up speed and speed and speed. It's like a snowball rolling off the mountain. It becomes bigger and gains more momentum and rolls faster and faster and faster and faster. And that's what is going to happen. And we're already pushing it to the limit. I mean, we are talking about limiting the Earth's warming by 2 degrees. That's what we're talking about right now.
Which is already catastrophic.
That's already going to cause enormous trouble for people who are living in the tropics, because that's where it all starts. It starts in the tropics. And if there's massive famine in the tropics and crops are going to fail, and because that's when people get moving. Once they don't have any water or food left, that's when they get on the move, because they want to live in the first place. And once they see what kind of a world that we Westerners live in, that we have built for ourselves, and they get a taste of this, they say, I'm never going to leave again. I'm not going back to that place. Forget about it. And I am perfectly fine with that. I mean, everybody deserves to be... Nobody deserves to be poor. Everybody has the right not to be poor.
I'd like to get to a stage where the whole world is a place you would want to go and visit and live for a few years.
If there's any chance of us getting there, it's nuclear and renewables, but mostly nuclear.
So I guess my question is, how do people who are coming round to the thinking that maybe nuclear needs to be part of the solution, how can they advocate for it, and how can they help be part of the solution?
That's the enigma we are trying to solve as well. I mean, there's a lot of infighting in the nuclear community at this moment, trying to figure out what the best communication strategy might be and whether we are alienating people or not. And so that's a very hard thing to sell. What I would say in the initial goal in advocacy should be to make people at least become more favorable towards nuclear, not being, don't judge Hinkley C too harshly, for instance. Make the companies and the government more comfortable with the idea that if they talk about nuclear, it won't cost them their heads, so that they can talk about nuclear with more confidence, because they don't talk about nuclear confidently enough, which has its ramifications on the general public, as I told you earlier. So I think that's the main goal here, is to help people become more comfortable with nuclear. And I would love for us to have movement, like AOC in the US, or all those people who are advocating for renewables and are marching the streets and doing such. What we need to do is become at least confident enough that we dare to walk in those crowds and hold up a banner and say, nuclear is good for the climate too. It's about, I believe that it's a comfort with, we have to become more comfortable with nuclear, and we can play a part in that. The government has to play a part in that, and the industry has to play a part in that.
Yeah, and we, there are some, organizations that you can support that are doing good work. Energy for Humanity is based in Europe, and that's they do some really good work and have published a number of papers that talk about, just the pragmatic, take on what we really need to do to get energy to all of humanity. The specific ones that deal with nuclear energy, Generation Atomic, as I mentioned, I work with them. Anybody can join volunteer calls that we have. If you want to get on an email list, you can go to generationatomic.org and get on that, and you'll get an occasional email about things that are going on. There's an app that they have for your phone that you can use to take certain, we call them digital actions. The Environmental Progress out in California is Michael Schellenberger's organization, and they do a lot of good research. You could throw a few bucks, a month to them or something like that. Either of those organizations would be happy to get more financial support. Generation Atomic is more kind of feet on the street oriented. Environmental Progress is takes kind of a bigger macro view in a lot of ways, and Michael Schellenberger does. He travels the world, and he has got a small staff that does some pretty good research, and they provide some good slides and things that many people use to make points like we were talking about on this call. So environmentalprogress.org is a good place to check out, and there's lots of material there to take a look at. It's letting your reps know, your government reps know that you expect them to support nuclear. That's everybody should do that.
Yeah, the thing is, we don't have that in Europe the way the U.S. has. I mean, we don't really have accessible representatives that you can just call.
Well, in the UK, you can write to your MPs for sure.
Yeah.
To let them know how you feel. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I did it. I did
reply.
I did in the Netherlands, and they just don't bother. It's like it's really bad. But what I wanted to say is, suppose that So I think comfort is one of the things that needs to be raised. Don't judge the nuclear industry too harshly, because many people think that it is just a money grabbing enterprise, which it surely isn't. Sure, some top executives get some big loads of money. That's inherent in any large endeavor, unfortunately, but it also employs. I think in the UK alone, at least 10,000 people. So I mean, just think about the fact that there's 10,000 families in the UK that are having bread on the table because of what their pa or ma does at the plant or in the industry in general. But what I wanted to say is, in the UK there are a couple of particularly good advocates, people who are actively seeking to improve the image of nuclear energy, and one of them is Kirsty Gogan, and she's for Energy for Humanity, which Alan managed. Kirsty Gogan lives in the south of London. I visited her earlier, last year. There's Malcolm Grimston. He's one who is very, very active when it comes to, making us understand why we react to nuclear the way we react. And he is if you would reach out to him, or any other person who is in your group of people, Malcolm Grimston, I'm sure he would be willing to help you find a better way. Jeremy Gordon is a consultant. He used to work at the World Nuclear Organization, and he's also based in London. I can put you in touch with all three. I mean, those three people are a bit. And then there's David Hess. David Hess is still at the World Nuclear Organization. I say still. I don't know if he has any plans to go away or not, out of the top of my head. And then there's also, the UK has some pretty good ones, right? I mean, George Monbiot, for instance.
Mm-hmm.
He's pro-nuclear.
Oh, okay.
And then there's also, why am I forgetting his name? There's George Monbiot. He's pro-nuclear. So, but I don't know of any pro-nuclear movements in the UK. I don't know if there are really real
Mark Linus is another one. Mark Linus.
Mark Linus. Oh yeah, Mark Linus, of course. Yeah, Mark Linus, met him too.
Well, the Extinction Rebellion in the UK is getting quite big, so I'm going to definitely they're getting big, and they're doing lots of protests. They were the ones who were naked in Parliament a couple of weeks ago. So they're getting a lot of press. So I'm going to look into what their position on nuclear is and see if I can contact them.
I am tentatively optimistic, but I'm not sure. Extinction Rebellion. That looks like a. Listen, what I also
their guys have just decided to take direct action, take it to the street, and about climate change. So hopefully,
here's one of the things that I have promised myself. It's basically something that I am, even though I am pretty left leaning, I have decided not to vilify people from the other side. That's one of the things that I am trying to do now, because I realize that whatever we are going to do into the future is going to have is going to require a solid base.
Yeah.
And I think that we need to steer clear from political pendulum swinging stuff.
Yeah.
That's one of the hardest things to do, because we are all looking for the quick solution. I'm not saying the easy solution, because none of the solutions are easy at this point. None of them are. But it's kind of seductive to see an ongoing monstrosity, an ongoing movement that has a lot of momentum, and try to latch on. And I don't know if that's a wise thing to do, I don't think that, for instance, energy-related matters should not be partisan.
No, absolutely not.
They should be. This is something that comes from. They should be rational decisions. If you look at it from a political standpoint, but in politics, nothing is rational. So.
But I think it's easier for Europeans to have this sort of attitude because you come from countries that your politics is proportional representation, so therefore people are used to working together.
It's
more.
glacial. So, everything is glacial over here.
Certainly with the UK, and I think with America, with the first past the post system, everything's adversarial, and it makes it so difficult.
Yeah. So I cannot tell you what the best way to do it in England is, to be honest. But for the US, I do have an idea because there's still bipartisan stuff that is going on. But I don't know. The adversarial nature of it is okay as long as it's not total oppositionalism, right? But that's more of a, I don't know. That's more of a philosophical.
Well, we need to be a community, and we need to be a community worldwide, globally, and we need to be, each of us has to have a community that we are part of locally, and that's going to include lots of different flavors of people, and that's the thing that keeps me going in my pro-nuclear work. I mean, if I was just all by myself kind of doing this, it would be a lot harder than it is right now, and it would be a lot less productive than it is.
That's the reason why Alan and I have teamed up, because otherwise we would be
we enjoy just kind of hashing out some of these things. As you probably could tell, it's not the first time that we've talked about these kinds of things, even on a video call with each other like this. So there are so many good people out there that and virtually all of them are good intentioned. It's really the task we have is to help people understand and deal with some of those irrational fears that they might have about radiation or nuclear technology, and understand at a little bit higher of a level just what's the scope of the problem that we have with global warming and with energy poverty and with other really big things. I mean, we have to solve those things, and we're not going to solve them by working as individuals. We're going to solve them by working together. So create or join a local community of some sort, whether that's locally for you is online, or if it's something that, or you could go to a coffee shop and meet with people, whatever it is, get some energy from others by working together like that. And that's a pretty key thing for anybody that's an advocate for anything. We're no different.
Yeah, this has been a long haul, guys. It's 1.5 hours.
Yeah,
so,
I think we better knock it on the head.
Yeah, I did we answer all your questions?
Oh, there could have been loads more questions, but they were the ones I thought. I think they were the ones I needed to ask. Good.
Well, we're not going to cut this thing off when I say goodbye, but at least I want to, for anybody who stuck with us during this time, to thank you for watching, and have a nice day. So